Hi, good afternoon. It's close. My name is Chris Johnson. I'm the Freeman Chair in China Studies here at CSIS. I want to thank you all for coming to join us today for what we hope will be a very exciting event. My colleague Scott Kennedy is actually going to moderate today's session, but I just wanted to offer a few introductory remarks. This is actually the first in a three-part series that we'll be conducting. This is under the umbrella of our China Reality Check series, where we try to look at issues that either we feel aren't getting enough attention in DC, are perhaps controversial in some way, or that we just think are interesting. But the focus of this series is actually going to be going from the Party Congress last fall and the work report that President Xi Jinping delivered, and then in a Politburo meeting that followed in the run-up to the Central Economic Work Conference, and then again at the Central Economic Work Conference. The party has laid out this idea of three tough battles that they'll be facing in the next 3 years running up through 2020. And those, of course, are the environment, rural revitalization, we can call it, and de-risking the financial sector. So we will be doing an event on each one of those, and we hope all of you can join us for those various events. We've got a really good lineup of speakers and are looking forward to that. And so, of course, today's session is on the environment. We're really pleased to be joined by two panelists. Jennifer Turner has been the director of the China Environment Forum at the Wilson Center for 18 years. She does research and leads programs related to many aspects of China's environmental challenges, particularly on water, energy, and green civil society issues. She leads the Wilson Center's Global Choke Point Initiative, which together with Circle of Blue has produced multimedia reports, films, and convened meetings on water-food confrontations in China, India, Mexico, South Africa, and the U.S. And she has a PhD from Indiana University, Bloomington, Scott's old alma mater. Alex Wang is assistant professor at the UCLA Law School and is a leading expert on comparative international law. He looks at China's environmental policy, the bureaucracy, public interest litigation, and the courts. And in the 2000s, Alex was a senior attorney for the Natural Resources Defense Council based in Beijing. He holds a JD from NYU Law. So with that, I'd like to welcome my colleague Scott up to the podium and our panelists as well. Please join me in welcoming them.
All right. Well, thank you, Chris, for getting the start of the series going, and thank you both for coming today. This is a topic near and dear to my heart, not only because my wife was an environmental consultant for many years, but because I've lived in China, traveled in China, and I know how important what China is doing on the environment is relevant for not just people in China, but for the planet as well. And we have two of the world's leading experts, not just in terms of research and writing, but in terms of activities, operations, to help us through this. So what I thought we would do is I'd ask a few opening questions to both of them to get things started, to warm us up. I might follow up with a couple things and then turn over the floor to Q&A with the audience, with all of you as well. So that's the plan for today. So my first question is really about sort of what's happening in terms of trends in the environment, and then secondly in terms of policy and what the government is doing about it. So I'm going to start with Jennifer to look at actual performance. And so as Chris said, the Chinese government has made controlling pollution a key goal for this year and the next coming 2 years. But a lot of us who look at China or think about it have this image in our mind of kind of this Dickinsonian industrial wasteland with massive pollution, problems with air, water, land. Of course, what we've also heard and seen that China's got more blue sky days. Average PMI 2.5 levels appear to be going down, at least what's being reported. And we did a report on the 13th five-year plan and noticed that an increasing number of the targets were environmental targets and more specific than in the past. So, but from your perspective, given that you've been following this closely, not only during the 18 years at the Wilson Center, but before, what's the record? What's your view of China's record, particularly lately? Where were they improving? Where are they still treading water? Where are they falling behind?
Wow.
And sorry.
He just gave me a couple minutes to do this, so we'll do our best. I mean, air pollution is what usually it's in your face and what people think about first when they think of China as, the barometer on what's happening on the environment. I think that, we did see, back in 2013, 2014, when you remember the war on pollution started, and a lot of really aggressive efforts in terms of requiring monitoring and new standards for particulate matter 2.5, the really tiny stuff that gets deep in your lungs, and closing coal-fired power plants. And then, so there was this big shift of polluting coal going out west, movement, that's the solution, get it out of the East Coast cities. But we did see, particularly in 2014 and 15, fairly, like 33% drops, every year, 13, 14, 15, of particulate matter 2.5 in the cities. But then there's, I'm going to whisper it, jobs. Right? If you start closing down coal-fired power plants, cement plants, steel plants, the provinces start getting a little bit nervous. And so the pressure kind of really emerged in late 2016, early 2017 that, well, we had to kind of open these things back up. And surprise, surprise, emissions started rising again for particulate matter in some of the cities. But remember, too, that the PM 2.5, it's not just coming from coal. There are those great cars that keep flooding the roads, and that's why we were talking over lunch how we all prefer the subway because it's not a parking lot. But yeah, so the air emission issue, I mean, there was a drop. Now it's kind of coming up, and now it's back down again. So that's kind of like, just think of like the wave. I mean, Beijing last year did drop like 53% from earlier on, like from 2012. But last year's overall drop in coal use was much less than the previous years. And I think, but then our friends at Greenpeace and other researchers are saying, like, because when you hear me talk about coal, you're thinking CO2 emissions, right? So China is still on track to meet their Paris commitment. They might actually not meet it, as early as, a couple of years ago when the war on pollution started, we all thought, yeah, they're going to meet it early. And now it's still going down, but keep in mind that the coal pie is still slowly growing in China. But in terms of, now, while air pollution always makes the headlines, I mean, I focus a lot on water pollution, and there too, it's a little bit more of a mixed bag. I think the government shifted a lot more attention. We have a water pollution action plan, and similar on the air pollution side, local governments are starting to feel actual pain if they violate their standards. And then even more miraculous last year was that the Ministry of Environmental Protection, long the underdog of ministries in China, they got some teeth. And there was something like 40,000 factories were, they had these strategic strike investigative teams that were closing factories down, doing quick assessments of what was happening with their emissions. I mean, wow, it's almost swashbuckling. And so that's an encouraging sign to see that the Ministry of Environmental Protection has teeth. So we can come back to water more, we can dive more deeply into it in the later discussion. Soil pollution, silence. Yeah, they passed soil pollution is not a good news story. I mean, they did pass I think there was a soil pollution action plan and a draft law. I'm looking at my EPA friends. No real action. What?
Second reading, still a draft.
It's still in draft. It's still in draft form. And partially because when you start looking at the numbers of something like, I don't know, like $50 billion to fix it up, because there's so much soil that's contaminated that this is a can of worms that they really don't want to open up. But there's some good news, because I was like, I want to make sure that my last little pollution vignette is good news. Waste, right? Because air and water are the big sexy topics that everyone always deals with. Soil we want to forget. But the waste issue really has kind of exploded into everyone's consciousness sometimes. Well, it actually exploded. 2015, we had a 22-story pile of construction garbage that collapsed and buried a town where migrant workers worked and villagers, and almost 80 people died. And so it was just crazy because they have so much waste from not only, this was construction waste from, China's building their cities, building new subway lines. They got to put that waste somewhere. But the big story is actually municipal solid waste. China produces a quarter of the municipal solid waste in the world. And it's like 300, what is that? I got to get my numbers right. There's so many numbers here. 300 million tons per year, and it's going to go up to 500 in a few more years. Where are you going to put it, right? Landfills are at capacity, and the solution that started getting more around 2007, they started building a lot of incinerators for garbage. The problem is Chinese cities don't sort their garbage. And if you know anything about incinerators, to burn, it has to be dry. But they can't. There's a lot of food waste in it. So the solution has sometimes been they throw oil and coal into it to make it burn, but still it can't reach a high enough temperature. So all the plastics in there, the dioxins get released. So incinerators have become a real hot button issue in a lot of cities. And I know that, Alex can probably talk about, there have been some legal cases where people have sued some incinerators for actual injury, children being born with deformities and whatnot. I don't know if you know about those cases. But so what's exciting to me, because I get excited about things like this, is that just at the beginning of, middle of last year, the National Development Reform Commission ordered that 46 cities are going to have mandatory waste sorting. So they want to really increase in those cities recycling up to 36%. Then they'd separate out the food waste, which later on we can talk about how that could be used for sludge methane capture, but that's our Q&A story, right? But so if you can start sorting your garbage, you can start reusing it. But the other story that you might have heard, let's see, how many of you heard the story that China is banning foreign recyclable exports? Okay, you guys have heard. Okay, a lot of people haven't heard that, but it pretty much rocked the recycling industry around the world, and many cities, particularly out on the West Coast, are having huge mountains of plastic recyclables that they don't know where to put it. So coming to your town soon, everyone, is going to be your city is trying to figure out what to do with your plastic waste. And basically, it's like that book, remember years ago, like when a billion Chinese jump, right? When a billion Chinese say no to our recyclables, we feel it here. But my optimism about the waste issue is that they're actually talking about it. They want to do some recycling, but also talking about maybe innovating on trying to have less toxic materials in the first place. Mm-hmm. They might want to try to ban, when you guys were in Beijing recently, how many of you were almost run over by a motorcycle on the sidewalk delivering food, right? Huge source of plastic waste now in China. It's the biggest pile of plastic waste containers anywhere in the world, and China just has no place to put it, and there's no one really recycling them. I'll leave it at that.
That's good.
Oh, wait, one. Okay.
All right, we'll come back for sure.
Because I have so many stories.
Yeah, plus, you had the best metaphors ever as well. But I was just, on the recycling and that's people are talking about it here in part because it's a trade barrier issue that all of a sudden China's breaking the rules on something. So not a surprise that in Washington we'd find something like that with the Chinese. Alex, let me turn to you. I should also mention Alex and I, we were part of the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations Public Intellectuals program together about 10 years ago. And so we got to travel through China and around the U.S. And so it's great to have the reunion with you here.
Absolutely.
And welcome to CSIS. So Jennifer touched on sort of the environmental performance. I want to ask you about environmental policy in China and the legal climate for controlling pollution. So my thumbnail sort of summary of China's political economy is that it has sort of three components. The Communist Party's got a monopoly on power. There's considerable bureaucratic infighting in Beijing and between Beijing and local governments. And in terms of economic priorities, China's a country by, for, and of industry. That sets up a political economy, a logic that doesn't lend itself well to aggressively addressing environmental issues. But maybe things have changed. Maybe the new era that Xi Jinping is leading has created a different political economy, a different equation, a different place for the environment. What's the story in this new era, and where is environmental policy going?
Right, great. Well, first of all, thanks for having me here, Scott, and thanks to CSIS. So, as you point out, and I see a number of old friends here in the audience when we know the old story about China and the environment, right? So, for the first 30 years of post-1978 reform and opening, the story was really, the local areas are really pushing hard for economic growth. Governance of environmental regulations very decentralized. It leads to a lot of local protectionism, weak capacity of the environmental regulators. There are a lot of laws on the books, but the question is really about enforcement, right? And so what we've really seen, even if I just think about over the last 10 years, there's really been a sea change in the, at least the political priority of environmental regulation, right? I was at a meeting in December with various officials, with some prosecutors, some regulators, other sort of general government officials, and sort of everyone is an environmentalist now, right? In the speeches, they're all talking about environmentalism, which was sort of jarring, right? I mean, at least even 10, 15 years ago, that was not the case. These days, I'll show a slide. I don't know if it's queued up. I have a slide of some. Yeah. So. So these days there's talk about this concept of ecological civilization, right? This is a concept of what China is sort of striving for. It's not a new concept. It was first introduced about 10 years ago, but Xi Jinping has really made it his own. Regularly in speeches, he's talking about this slogan: "Clear waters and green mountains are as good as mountains of gold and silver," right? Sometimes loosely translated as "green as gold," right? And so this is a regular part of speeches at home and abroad. He used this at a UN speech in Europe. And if you look at the sort of party rhetoric, there's a lot of, there are a lot of op-eds by professors of Marxism about how eco-civilization kind of fits into the whole story of socialism. Now, one of the slogans is it's a 5-in-1 reform, how ecological civilization is being folded into political, economic, cultural, and what's the other ones? I think civic kind of social development, right? And so, in the talk about economic growth, now it's all about high quality growth is the mantra, right? And so there's a lot of change in the rhetoric, and one thing that you notice, it used to be that environmental officials were the only ones talking about environmental protection, and maybe they didn't even talk like environmentalists, but now everyone's talking about it. But that's just rhetoric. But so the question is always, is it really doing anything on the ground? Jennifer's already gestured at some of the things that are going on the ground. Nowhere more than in the air pollution area we're seeing real action. One thing about air pollution is it's very visible. It's also, you're able to monitor it from afar. There's NASA satellite data that verifies that there have been changes. There's hourly third-party verification by the U.S. Embassy monitor and the consulate monitors that can sort of tell you whether the official Chinese data is true. And there have been improvements, right? And we know this. I spent some time looking at some of the documents on this, and whereas in the past, 10 years ago, the critique would be that there are a lot of documents about environmental regulation, but it would be very general, sort of inoperable. You wouldn't really know what it signaled for people to do. These days, the documents are very specific. For example, over the winter, because the Clean Air Action Plan that Jennifer referenced started in 2013. It's a 5-year plan. It's sort of the end of that period is right around now. There are a lot of government targets for reducing pollution. As is typical when you have a target system and there's a deadline, people are scrambling at the end to sort of meet these targets. And one of the things they did was they set up a special winter campaign, right? This built on already probably the largest series of enforcement campaigns that China had really ever seen on the environment. For over the last few years, they're sending thousands of regulators down to the countryside and making inspections. Over just starting in September, they had a very detailed set of plans where they were going down to the county level. The requirement was for the local governments to produce lists in something like 12 categories. Small boilers that should be shut down. This category of sort of unpermitted plants, sanluan, kind of this the kind of unpermitted plants that didn't have pollution control, that sort of thing. Clean heating, right? This became controversial. We'll talk about that more. That was, some 4 million households had to have their coal-fired heating changed to gas-fired heating, and coal was banned. What else? Major industrial facilities had to have pollution control installed. Some firms would have to be shut down and moved. There were lists had to be provided to check if that was happening. Getting down to the level of gas stations. Is vapor from gas stations being controlled, temporary work stoppages. So some of this is in the nature of something that China had been practicing for a while, right? When there are specific events, you do a lot of shutdowns and temporary measures, right? We started to see this in the years before the Olympics, right? First time it happened probably was there was a major meeting of African leaders. They shut down car traffic for a couple of days. It had a major effect, and we've seen it at APEC, the Olympics, a number of other major events. But a number of these are also permanent, right? So they're installation of equipment, changing of the equipment to cleaner types of energy production and industrial production. And so the results, if we believe the data, which I think we have really reason to believe the data, is Beijing met its target of 60 micrograms per cubic meter, the air quality concentration for PM 2.5, significant percentages of decreases in the Beijing area. In the Yangtze River Delta, Pearl River Delta also decreases. And so that's been very interesting to see. And I think everyone has a sort of theory of why this happened, right? It wasn't the same story we tell about American environmentalism. It wasn't, the story we tell ourselves here, and I think the EPA would tell the same story. It's sort of about a civic story, the public demand, Earth Day, kind of Rachel Carson, Silent Spring, these types of things pushing forward, kind of a bottom-up movement. But I think largely many people agree that the leadership in China saw at least 4 major reasons for doing this, right? I think one, there's a technocratic explanation. You're just seeing the limits, ecological limits, right? You walk out the door, you see that this cannot get worse, right? It's just there are days where it's literally completely no visibility. I think the leadership recognized, look, we need to get control of that. That's directly connected to economic development. So if you want to keep the economic development train going, you need to figure out a different way to produce, not just steel, cement, and these types of things. And so the mantra of higher quality growth, moving to services and high-tech industries, clean energy, these types of things. Social stability, there was a bottom-up story, right? And it was about protests and people being upset, right? And that has changed over time, right? 10 years ago, if people wore masks on the street, normally it wasn't because of air pollution. People would say, oh, that's fog or something like that. But gradually that awareness really was growing and people were upset about it. And there were sort of NIMBY-related protests also as people bought more property and they were worried about pollution affecting their property and their health and so on and so forth. And probably the fourth reason is, Chinese leaders do care about their reputation, especially in a period where the country is growing stronger. They're heading out into the world for investment and for political purposes. The lack of soft power, a lot of people have talked about how that's a real shortcoming. And probably on no other issue, the environment is probably the area where China has gotten the most traction on soft power, showing that they've been active on this and doing something positive. That has really changed compared to, say, Copenhagen, which was less than 10 years ago, 2009. China was pilloried at Copenhagen as a blocker of climate action, intransigent, and not really seemingly prepared for the international negotiations there. But they really made a comeback, huge comeback. By Paris, they were active in a leadership position and got terrific press, and I think for legitimate reasons, and they've really turned things around. So I think there's been a big change, but there are also some reasons for concern that I'll mention now, but we can talk about a little bit more. I mean, I think there's a utilitarian nature to the environmental move, right? You're sort of making this big macro move, but what about things like environmental justice, right? So this brings us back to the scandal over the winter heating, right? So the campaign-style enforcement, the attempt to achieve targets, the attempt to switch out heating for 4 million households led to implementation problems. It led to pictures of people with no heating because they didn't get the gas-powered heaters installed in time. Kids, school children having to sit outside because it's too cold inside the school, and that sort of thing. And then it led to a backtrack in policy. With the campaigns have targeted big actors, big state-owned enterprises, and a lot of small mom and pop shops, and people are suggesting, look, some of this went overboard. It's going after people who aren't really polluters, but people are trying to meet their quotas, and so they're throwing on everyone just so they don't get in trouble for leaving someone out. And so, are some of these people being treated unjustly? The environmental crimes prosecutions is way up, thousands of environmental crime prosecutions. And there's a well-known critique of the criminal justice system. Is there sufficient criminal procedure? Are these things being handled in just ways? And so these are really just questions, right? We don't completely know what's empirically happening, but in any massive campaign like this, you'd have to be, you want to be concerned about this, and I think the leadership would be concerned about these things. So I think these are things that need to be addressed. And so I'll just stop there, and I'd love to continue the discussion.
Sure.
Yeah.
I wouldn't ever want to use the phrase a feel-good story with a top-down campaign that's so much pressure. But for those who want to find a positive side to the Xi Jinping approach to the China model, this would be some evidence that one could say this might be a way that's working, not across the board, and there's might be some rough edges where some folks don't get treated well, but you can see the difference. I remember being in Beijing in early 2013, and a reporter called me and asked about the air, and I looked up and I couldn't see the top of the building I was standing next to. Right. It was the middle of the air apocalypse. I think Beijing was like 700 PM 2.5 or something like that. And I almost dropped my phone and fell down and choked to death. So it is different, at least in the places that we get to see, and I guess the data shows overall average. I want to go and talk about two things that both of you raised, one and the other. The first is, because most of the conversation has been about the initiative of the leadership and what's driven these things. I want to ask about two other participants in particular. First of all, social pressure, social movements, and then about the international side of things. But let's start on the domestic social side, because you still have people who are environmentalists, activists, you have lawyers. What is the social activism trend been amongst environmentalists, scholars, amongst lawyers and lawsuits, amongst also companies and corporate social responsibility and philanthropy, journalists? I remember the Under the Dome, and maybe that's already out of date, the way that was treated, but maybe not. Maybe we'll start with you, and because you've got some also real life experiences and interacting with some of these
there's so much.
as well.
I mean,
Yes.
in my work at the Wilson Center over 18 years, I've had a lot of the Chinese environmental NGO folks come and give talks, like someone sitting here. And it's been fascinating to watch, to see how, just general broad brushstrokes, that the NGO movement that really started in 1994 when they could actually register, going from very safe issues, recycling, animal protection, to hard-hitting, Center for Legal Assistance for Pollution Victims, Institute for Public and Environmental Affairs, Ma Jun's organization, creating online air pollution, water pollution database, and super exciting, another good news story. The State Oceanic Administration released data on ocean quality, so they're mapping that too. And so it's been really exciting to see some of the NGOs getting involved in kind of these transparency issues, and also working on green supply chain. And I can give you, when we talk about international groups, there's a lot of international with Chinese groups doing these green supply chain type projects. And a newer area of my own research we've been doing some kind of scoping and conversations in China on citizen science, so, right? Where you have, most times you think the first thing that leaps into most people's mind was during that beloved air apocalypse that you got to be participating in, Scott, where some of the NGOs were renting out air quality monitors so they could kind of measure the air quality and load it up line, joining the US Embassy on like, look, our numbers are not what the Chinese government is saying. But then, so there's kind of like, naughty government kind of scolding stuff. But there's also been some really interesting new work with some NGOs like Global Environmental Institute. They have a project up in Sanjiangyuan, the Three Rivers area, where they're working with some Tibetan communities. They wanted to try to look at like, how can we know what is climate change impact in these very arid regions? Because they felt like the government needs to make better climate adaptation policy, but they don't have the data. And so they actually approached the Wilson Center because we have a citizen science program. So we were kind of just given some little tips when we were in China. I took my citizen science colleague to China with me. And so they've actually been teaching and having the communities there, these Tibetan communities, gathering data. So it's not like big data, but it's like big data at a small level. But this is useful information to make better policy. And then going across the country in Hunan, my old hometown, Changsha, Green Hunan. We've had them come and speak once, hopefully coming again soon. They have a river watch program where they have now 500 citizens who volunteer to walk along 3 river basins in the north part of Hunan province. And so they use their iPhones, and they take pictures, geolocate, and they've become an early warning system on pollution problems in these river basins. So they can WeChat, tweet in US terms, the information to Green Hunan, who can alert the local Environmental Protection Bureau so they can enforce. Now, there's a bigger potential to this, right? Citizens don't just have to be these passive monitors. This is also educating people and kind of giving them a sense of empowerment. And Green Hunan has kind of used this kind of energy to do other activities to kind of get the people to, my favorite was getting trash pickup along the river and passing out postcards and all the small children writing cards to the mayor and say, we picked up so much garbage. And suddenly copycat, this is like the good kind of copycats, where cities all around Hunan, you have all these children writing letters to their mayors who are like, oh my God, So it's a different way of it's a different kind of angle of accountability. You've got Beijing upstairs ready to cut your development funding, and you're starting to get citizens kind of percolating up with some things. And my last story, and then I'll shut up, I promise. A top-down citizen science project. The Ministry of Environmental Protection and the Ministry of Housing and Urban Development had 2 years ago, had this idea. They said, hey, Chinese public, let us know. I think it started in Beijing. Let us know if you see a black and smelly river, take a picture, geolocate it, and send it to us, and we'll take care of it. They were avalanche of information texted to them and WeChatted to them. So they had to go to the Ma Jun's shop and say, we have all this information. And so they started making maps of it. And other NGOs in Ma Jun's network of water people started making more maps about it. So it's raising the awareness. But again, it's intriguing to me, like the idea that citizens getting involved in actual collection of data.
And do they call them citizens? Gongmin.
I think that the term that we don't use the term citizen science. What do we use? Yeah, we don't do gong judgment. I think we do public participation science.
Okay, all right. I just wanted to double check on that little terminology issue, but it's still fascinating. It's the way, it's the real active. It makes a difference, even if you have to tweak the term a little bit. Let me turn to you, Alex, now, because on what society is doing. And what lawyers are doing, not just bringing cases, but other aspects in the way that they are helping facilitate. We've heard a lot at CSIS about the problems of rights lawyers and other things, but maybe perhaps this is a different story.
Yeah, well, so when I was with NRDC, probably the 2 big areas that we worked on were, one was promoting public interest litigation. We have Zhang Jinjing here, who's one of the lawyers from China who did a lot of this work. And we also pushed on transparency issues, and I worked with Ma Jun and others quite a lot on that. And so there's been progress in both, right? So on the public interest litigation, a lot of people were promoting this, and in the last 5 years, there's been legal authorization for this type of suit for NGOs. Average single citizen can't bring this type of suit, public interest litigation, but there's certain conditions. It has to be registered. NGO has to have been around for a certain amount of time, has to not have had legal trouble, that sort of time. So there are restrictions. There are probably a few hundred groups that were capable of bringing groups. Not that many groups are bringing these suits. I was in touch with Friends of Nature as one of these groups. They, by their count, probably about 10 NGOs are actively bringing these suits. So I think we saw success in this area in terms of there's policy progress, and there's been some action in sort of people bringing suits. But I personally feel a little bit disappointed in the impact of it. I think one part of it is just simply what's the role of courts in China. It's not going to have the same impact if you're an American public interest lawyer. The nature of the court system and the types of suits you can bring can have a much broader impact kind of on policy. In China, really, they're much more dealing with individual cases, and possibly they'll have some broader deterrent effect, but more likely they're dealing with the specific problem. And so these cases are going on, and that's all to the good, but I think the numbers of them are not as many as many people might have hoped. On the transparency side, that's been, I think, a real positive development, right? So broadly speaking, within the government, there's been movements towards transparency. In other areas in the judiciary, there's been a big movement towards transparency, a lot of court cases appearing online and that sort of thing. And in the environmental area, there's been a big push for transparency. So this started a while ago. Now everyone, I'm sure everyone in the room, many people probably have the apps that you can check the air quality. And a few years ago, factories started disclosing their emissions. And these things have helped, right? Before, you can only speculate on the condition of a plant. Now there are lots of plants that show up in the official data as violators, and it can trigger action. Certainly there may be a problem with data quality. It almost certainly is a problem with data quality, and some firms are cheating. But even if we assume cheating, there's still thousands of firms that you can target and that show up as having violations. So the transparency has really helped spur a lot of the things, citizen supervision. And it also, I think, creates an enabling environment that, even though the types of things Jennifer is talking about are not sort of official government transparency, it sort of creates the environment that says that kind of thing is okay and it's accepted, right? We welcome that, and it's been written into the environmental protection law that public participation and transparency are good things. The flip side of that is that this is all cabined, of course, right, within the political system of China. There's has always been Chinese NGO registration. There's now foreign NGO registration. And these things are, to the proponents of it, they just said, look, this is just us regulating a potential risk, and what's wrong with that? But of course, there's the potential for chilling effect and people kind of pulling back and not advocating as aggressively as they might otherwise advocate, and maybe that's the point of the system, right? Mm-hmm. And so people know that their action has to be cabined. The good thing is that because it's such a government priority, there's a lot of things to do, and so NGOs can get involved and do things that are squarely within government priorities, and you largely have very little political risk. But if you really want to push the boundaries, there are lots of signals that tell you that you shouldn't do that, right? The rights lawyers, the under the dome censorship, there are clear signals that say there are limits, and just stay within the limits.
That's super helpful. I think the work that I did on philanthropy, I think we found the same type of thing, is that there were certain kinds of philanthropy, regardless of what areas, education, environment, healthcare, that you could do. You could do projects. You could actually go out and you could help people. But if you did advocacy, public, pressure, you would immediately notice the boundaries. So let me look now. Let's look at this from the outside in, from the international side of things. You mentioned the foreign NGO law, which we're all from NGOs, and we've got folks from NGOs here, and some of them, I think
Big smiles
Ken is here from Brookings, and Brookings is lucky they have an office in China and works on the environment there from their Tsinghua Center, but most of us don't. What is on the international cooperation side? What does the new era mean for it? Is there, what type of projects have you been working on that, has there been any change, made them more problematic, more difficult, implementation harder, folks who don't answer phones now, or you have to switch to different types of partners, on the legal education side, or any of the things, sort of what's it feel like in terms of the international cooperation? You've already mentioned Paris, that China's doing much better, but I was sort of in the day-to-day sort of international cooperation side. What do things feel like now? Why don't we start with Alex, and we'll come back to Jennifer.
Sure. Yeah. So I'm not on the front lines with the NGOs anymore, but I still am in contact with my old partners and the people I used to work with. And I think in terms of the work that people are doing, they're by and large able to continue doing the work. In terms of the foreign NGOs, I think the registration requirements have led to some groups exiting, right? They didn't feel like they could really meet the requirements, and for others, it's clearly a cost, right? It's an administrative burden, and it's a worry in the same way that I think it was a worry for the Chinese NGOs that were subject to similar types of reporting and that sort of thing. And it just is a limit. I think the hope, and this is relatively new, right? People have just sort of gotten their partners, and they're now seeing what this is about. I think people are just hoping, look, it was just an administrative burden. We did it, and now we can just carry on. So I think it remains to be seen on that. But that said, there's still in the environmental area, there's a tremendous amount of international cooperation. I was at the CCICED is a Canadian-Chinese kind of government level cooperation. I was at their annual meeting in December, and basically every major environmental NGO in the world was there, including and the UN, the EU, lots of quasi-governmental foundations and so on. And they all have projects with some part of China. So there's a lot of work to be done, and people are still doing it. One aside in response to your earlier comment that, look, this seems to be a positive story. I think one other caveat that I wanted to add that I forgot to mention earlier is that we've been talking a lot about the air pollution context, and I think one thing we have to at least raise a question about is what happens in other areas that are simply less visible, right? There's a lot of public pressure on air pollution, a lot of visibility, a lot of third-party monitoring, but what happens in the area of soil pollution, right, where it's much more costly, a lot of reasons why people wouldn't want to spend the money and do the work, and it's much harder to monitor. So I think we have, when we branch out, there's 1,000 environmental problems in China. How much success we're going to see on those areas.
Okay,
thanks. Because I've been watching this for a long time, but a lot of the international groups, particularly U.S. ones, they have pretty deep roots, and most of the major ones, they have, or they're in the process of getting their registration. But what's been great over the years with the U.S. groups, they've been kind of a glue that sometimes, a lot of their projects, it's not just them doing it by themselves. They work with the government. They have both local and center businesses, other NGOs. So it makes it a little bit more resilient, not to sound trite, but it's true. These projects have been ongoing, and I think the challenge with the registration for a lot of, in this first year, because I don't know how many of you in the room have had to register, but we don't know, you have to make a plan ahead of time. And I don't know about you, Alex, but do you know what you're doing in 6 months, on a project? It's hard to know, or even you. But there's also a lot. This first year is going to be educating your local public security bureau, who don't understand what an NGO is, and foundations I think have it a little bit. The major ones, they've gotten their registration and they're okay. I think what's also been an interesting shift, and Scott, maybe you can add to this since you've done philanthropy stuff, but a lot of the Chinese NGOs, in anticipating for this, have started to switch much more to local foundations and companies. So trying to get themselves off the international support, but that's still kind of tricky because so many of these NGOs have been dependent on foreign NGO or foreign foundation support, and so it's. And I'm still learning, how to navigate it. But when I go to China, I'm a guest of someone. I'm the speaker. I'm not co-sponsoring things because I guess that would entail getting a temporary registration, and no one quite knows how to do that yet.
Okay, super. Well, a lot of food for thought. I would just on the philanthropy side on that gap. I do think they're in the middle of trying to switch. There's less international funding for these. What we have seen is overall philanthropy numbers have risen lately, including directed toward the environment, in part through the creation of these new trusts. Mm-hmm. So you have rich entrepreneurs who are creating trusts, but they've been created. They haven't been drawing down a lot of the money yet to actually spend. And so I think implementing is the next stage for that. Okay, I think we've got enough food on the table, and let's open up the conversation. I think we've got a microphone. And so please wait for the microphone, identify yourself and your organization, and if you could keep your comment relatively brief into a question, that'd be great. Why don't we start right here in the front? Okay. Yes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Paolo von Schirach. I'm the president of the Global Policy Institute here in Washington. I appreciate very much this tour d'horizon. A lot of information, a lot of details, but let me ask a fundamental question here. China's the the legitimacy of China's political leadership is in making the numbers on economic growth, right? A few weeks ago, we were told we've done extremely well. In fact, we have exceeded our targets. Of course, those numbers are questionable. I guess everybody has their own idea of what the real numbers of GDP growth are. But here's my question. Fixing the environment, when you have problems that have accumulated over many decades, as all of you know extremely well, is an effort of staggering dimensions. Obviously, if you want to be serious about that, you have to divert billions and billions and billions of dollars from capital investments into first fixing the damage that has already been created, and then going forward, building into greenfield enterprises the cost of environmental protection. Here's the question. Can China walk and chew gum at the same time? That is to say, is there, considering, as I suspect, that the rate of growth of GDP growth is far less significant than what the leadership is telling us, and the declared objective now that environmental protection, fixing the environment, and going forward, creating a better situation for new enterprises is so incredibly expensive. And considering, as you have mentioned in passing at the beginning, that you've got to keep people happy. That is, you can't close everything down like during the Olympics to show air quality, because that has certain disadvantages in terms of employment, etc. How do you see this going forward? In other words, definitely the conversation has changed. As you pointed out, the pronouncements of the leadership are completely different. There's more transparency, openness, etc. But to what extent is this just cosmetic? And to what extent are we talking about the real investments that are necessary to be transformative? I don't see that. I'm as positive and optimistic as I would like to be. I don't see that this is transformative at all. This is trying to do a few things and try to get as much good press as possible under difficult circumstances to assuage a lot of public concern and all these grassroots environmental groups and all what you have described. So my question is, and I know it's a difficult one, is do you see this as being transformative, that we're going to turn the corner here, or that this is about controlling pollution as opposed to solving the pollution problem? Thank you very much.
I can run down. I mean, China for the last 5 years has been the #1 investor in clean energy technologies like wind, solar. Yeah, problem. Sometimes you have garbage wind, doesn't get on the grid. But they're making lots of investment, pushing new laws on distributed renewables. I mean, they're putting their money where their mouth is. But they also, in terms of green finance, I'll be smarter in a couple of weeks. I invited a bunch of green finance people to come talk to me on March 5th about the green bond market that they started 2 years ago. And banks, I mean, a number of banks, the big ones, the Agricultural Bank, China Development Bank, they're all trying to develop what is green finance. And I'm hopefully going to host a smaller bank coming to the US in the summer that really wants to understand how can they be China's biggest green bank. And in terms of learning, and they're working with Citibank already to help fund energy efficiency projects. Yeah, and then even, I mean, it's not quite financing, but just even think about the National Carbon Trading Scheme, and maybe Alex can jump in a little bit more on that, but the fact that they're trying to create mechanisms where companies are going to have to, they're going to be given credits. They're going to have to try to either invest to clean up, or you're going to have to buy from somewhere else. So some of these things could be like, institutions in waiting, but they really are moving forward on financing. And just this year, they have an environmental protection tax. Doesn't include CO2 or cars, unfortunately, but everything else. But the fact that they're finding, and they're not just going to take it upstairs, they're going to make sure that the local governments, and this is where there could be slippage, right, Alex? What will the local governments do with the taxes collected on environment? The kind of monitoring that has to take place. But it's to answer, they've thrown out numbers, how many billions of dollars they need, and so they're trying to set up the mechanisms to make that happen.
Yeah, so I mean, you're asking one of the fundamental questions, right? And so, how real is any of this, right? So, there's a couple of responses to that, right? One is that, as Jennifer's alluding to, and I think Scott has been working on electric vehicles. That's a good example of this, right? So, there's a business logic to some of what they're doing that is beneficial to the environment, right? So, if they want to work on electric vehicles, part of it is that it's an open field, it's a new industry, and China has a chance to break into it and make some real money there, right? So, and there are a number of industries, and a lot of the clean energy area, you could argue, has a similar logic to it, and so that would be pro-environment, but it is completely consistent with what we know about a leadership that wants to spur environmental growth. On this issue of legitimacy in making the numbers, I think we need to think about differences among issue areas, right? Again, what I mentioned before is with air pollution, it's the area that's the most easily verified, right? And so you're more likely to see real action there. You should have much more concern where there's much greater uncertainty and difficulty in monitoring, and it's plausible that there's been so much press about air pollution that it comes to stand for broader success elsewhere when we don't have full verification of that. So we should demand verification in these other areas. I mean, even when you get to climate, to the extent that it's stuff that's not related to the air pollution, there's some challenges in verifying some of that. Soil, certainly, water has its own difficulties. And I think the third point is how efficient is all of this, right? The environmental regulation from above clearly has its inefficiencies, right? It's very coarse, broad brush, one-size-fits-all attack on pollution. This is, scholars within China often raise this critique, right? Let's customize it, let's let the local have a little more leeway to make it flexible, more efficient. And because the lack of efficacy has been such the primary problem, it just wasn't getting done at all. No one was talking about efficiency, right? But maybe now that we're having some success on the air pollution, it's time to start talking more about how to make it more efficient. Because as you said, you're spending a lot of money on it, and if you throw all of your money at something, you can do it, but of course it's also taking money away from other things, right? So that's an issue that hasn't sufficiently been talked about.
Yeah, I would agree. The Communist Party is not the Green Party of China. We know that. We know it's not the Green Party. Yeah. So, but are they? But I don't think we ought to just dismiss it as totally just cosmetic. And it is very difficult to move this political economy in this country, and because you are trying to not just walk and chew gum, but eat jiaozi and do lots of different things at the same time. So balancing multiple goals at the same time is kind of hard. So as concerned as we are about implementation and actual, it's not just a PR. I don't think it's just PR.
I mean, on coal, they have shifted the Titanic.
Yeah. We're gonna go all the way to the back corner now.
Thanks. Philip Benoit with CSIS Energy Program. Hi, Alex. One thing that we know when we think about China's state-owned enterprises are dominant and dominate a lot of the pollution issue. And I guess the question is for Alex and other people, is there actually a potential to make state-owned enterprises in China agents of positive change when it comes to the issue of reducing pollution?
Good SOEs.
Yeah. I think it's hard. It's hard to know, but I think one. I've written a little bit about this, but there's a way that you could. One thing that people say is that maybe the SOEs. There's a little bit more ability to influence the direction they go because there's some kind of political controls, and you can also channel lots of financial carrots towards them and that sort of thing. And I think some of what you're seeing is that SOEs in traditionally polluting industries are picking up business in the newer clean energy and that sort of thing, and they are, the logic of it would be that they're able to profit from some of these new opportunities, and so that's one way that they can be a positive force. We have lots of stories of how they've been negative forces in blocking improvements to fuel quality and these types of things, and so I think that will continue to be a problem. They're some of the biggest companies in the world, and they have a lot of influence because of that, but perhaps with sufficient carrots and giving them a piece of the new pie, maybe you can kind of move that ship as well.
Well, I mean, just harkening back to the national CO2 emissions trading. I mean, it is going to target larger companies, and those are state-owned enterprises. And so, I mean, they're the big dogs. I mean, obviously, there's the question like, well, what's the price going to be on this? But they're not being excluded, and so and that even like Shenhua, the largest coal company in the world, has been making significant investments into renewable energy because they're diversifying their portfolio, but also thinking about what that means for going overseas as well. So yeah, it's again, we won't paint them completely green, but
Yeah. I would say on the electric cars, it's State Grid.
yeah, stay creative.
They provide electricity, and they're happy to provide electricity for charging for electric cars. But in any case, so there are potential ways to incentivize. I think one of the most interesting things will be construction companies. To what extent can you get construction companies to build with materials, to build like our building, highest certified in the? Can you get Chinese to? Well, because carbon emissions a big giant problem in our buildings and building materials, right? So, okay, yes, in the third row, and I'm going to come up here next to this woman in the front after. Sorry.
Hi, thank you so much, Alex and Jennifer. I appreciate all the great work and attention you have focused all your focus on this really important issue. My question is related to a shocking criminal case last year that received attention in the Chinese media and some in the U.S. media as well too. And what I'm talking about is in October 2016, environmental officials in Xi'an were detained for essentially putting air masks on the monitoring equipment. And so last June, 7 officials were sentenced from a year to 2 years. This is environmental monitoring officials who receive criminal sentences. And so my question is I greatly appreciate the work you've done on sort of the cadre evaluation system. And as you may remember, back in 2008, I published research that found in Beijing, manipulation of the air quality data only started in 2004, and that was the year that the municipal government set targets for individual districts for air quality and for meeting sort of blue sky targets. And so my question is why even now do environmental monitoring officials have responsibility for meeting targets? It doesn't make sense to sort of pay the umpire, based on, the score of a game or something like that. So,
You want to
appreciate your comments.
take that? Or,
That's a more legal.
Yeah, I mean, so data quality is a huge issue, right? In lots of areas of the Chinese economy, and you've done great work exposing this blue sky day problem, about a decade ago, right? And it continues to be a problem, and we continue to worry about it. Again, with the air pollution, the benefit is that you do have lots of third-party verification in various forms. You can check what's going on to some extent. The other thing that I would say is, 10 years ago when we raised this issue, it's a natural thing if you're having international cooperators to raise this issue. In the U.S., you have criminal sanctions. It's a very important part of the integrity of the system to penalize data falsification. And 10 years ago, you would be sort of met with silence in the room. No one wanted to talk about it. And I always took it as sort of, there's this tacit sense that people knew it was going on, and they didn't want to expose it too much, and you didn't want to deal with it. These days, there's been the passage of rules to deal with data falsification. There's been prosecutions. There is some attempts to deal with it. Again, you can ask yourself, is it symbolic? Is it legitimate? Is it real? But I think all you can say is that there seem to be some movements to address the issue, but it's still a very open question. We don't know to what extent, how bad the problem is.
But then also there's even the question that we've had over the years that my EPA friends talking about, even their ability to adjust the monitors, correct? I mean, the continuous monitoring technology, you have to constantly be adjusting it and fixing it up, and sometimes they'll just install it and it's just there. And I think that's still a challenge as well.
That there are technical problems with calibrating the monitors and
calibrating it
that
regularly
sort of thing.
and
if
things
you don't
like
do
that.
it well,
So I mean, there's the actual trying to
results.
jigger the numbers, and there's just sometimes just,
Are you still following this a lot closely?
To some extent.
Yeah.
I was interested, it's not just Xi'an, I mean also the MEP strongly criticized the Tianjin government for manipulating monitoring data by, I think, spraying water next to the monitors, which is sort of this old trick. But again, here you had MEP, one of the central inspection teams, strongly criticizing Tianjin late last year for doing similar things. And so to me, the main issue is sort of the concern that the monitoring officials should not have responsibility or should not feel pressure to meet targets like that?
So it partly depends on which metrics you're looking at, right? So the target to meet, they've already announced last month that they want to have, I think, cities and above, they want to have 80% of days as blue sky days, right? So that's the metric that you were kind of looking at, and it's easy to kind of manipulate that one, right? Because again, you just get it a little bit below, and there's all sorts of things you can do. You caught just this very simple kind of mechanical change in the tabulation, but then you could spray water around monitors, and these things are ways that you can manipulate it. On the PM 2.5 concentrations, you have a little more ability to look at it through satellite and that sort of thing, and so. So yeah, I mean, it's an ongoing battle, I guess. Yeah.
We're gonna come right here to the woman in the front.
Thank you. Hi, thanks. This has been really interesting. My name is Jill Zwicker. I'm a student at the Hopkins Nanjing Center right now, so Happy New Year. We're on break.
Yeah.
I guess this is related to that. The information asymmetry problem regarding environmental information disclosure in China. You guys have already mentioned some NGOs like IPE and their maps, and Greenpeace and NRDC with their reports. And I guess I'm just interested in what your opinions are regarding the effect that NGOs in China, through their efforts towards environmental information disclosure, what effect, if any, it's had on creating and enforcing environmental policies, especially in the realm of water governance in China. Thanks.
So the role of NGOs in doing something?
In particular, their information disclosure platforms. Because I know they can't collect data on their own. Most of the data they get is from government
unless
organs.
you're Greenpeace.
Right.
Greenpeace, ultra naughty, their detox campaign, and
right.
but they don't necessarily make it public. They do kind of like quiet naming and shaming of going to the detox campaign. They would go measure water quality, and then the classic story is going to Zara and other companies and saying, did you know that your suppliers are doing this? Why don't you join us and help green your supply chain? And slightly different, it's not quite information transparency, but I have to brag about NRDC working on in the textile industry, coming up, working with local government. And I think that's what I like seeing the most successful projects, be they information transparency or pollution control. They work with local governments and small and medium enterprises to help develop low-cost, no-cost options for lessening pollution from the textile industry, the clothes we're all wearing, people, all right? But also within that, also saving energy. And it's been hugely successful. And even like Institute for Sustainable Communities working with WRI on CO2 emissions and pollution emissions. So there's a lot of this kind of, I think that the transparency information, sometimes maybe it's not like out to the world, but when they work with companies, again with the government as well, to help them solve concrete problems for these smaller enterprises who can never get bank loans, by the way, right? These companies, the state-owned enterprises, they can get all the money they want, but these small companies, they're not getting it. And that's why I'm really encouraged when I see these kind of projects that are targeting the small and medium enterprises and the local governments who own them.
Yeah, I mean, I think the core question you're asking about how much impact they're having, I think, is a little bit uncertain, right? I mean, it would be great to see, like, attempt to quantify how much pollution is actually being reduced. But I think the logic of programs like what Jennifer is mentioning is, you can see how it would work, right? It's really the Walmarts of the world are working with the NGOs, and they have a business logic to wanting to get the suppliers to reduce their pollution. And I'd heard stories from that initiative. There were just basic things that the suppliers were doing that were very inefficient because 5 years ago they were really just farmers or something like that, and they just started a factory. They really had no idea how to make the factory more efficient, and by providing some efficiency improvements, they really, just for example, the one example I often cite is they had an example of dyeing, different batches of dyeing, whereas if you had, like, say, a dark blue and a light blue and a yellow, often they would dump water for each batch. Yeah. But if you can use the light blue and then use that water for the dark blue, you save a third of the water, right? And that has costs associated with it and that sort of thing. So the companies seem to be quite receptive to this. The Walmarts of the world would have major supplier meetings where they would be trained on these types of things. And obviously for the suppliers, it's about getting the business. And for Walmart, they can imagine driving costs down further because of that.
And there are actually more studies. I mean, we always cite IPE, but others who are doing like risk assessments that are targeting the companies or the investors, which I always think is funny. Isn't the investor just the government? But whatever. But trying to really switch it. The lingo. Risk is the new sexy now when you're talking, for talking at the business sector. It was green supply chain before. Now it's talking about risk, and I think that's also kind of got the ears up of the companies in China that they need to, because they're aware that they've got the central government wanting to come down on them for pollution, and now they're being told, well, it's actually a business risk. You could save money if you address this, like, woo. So, I mean, that's another kind of interesting shift of conversations that I'm seeing in China, too.
This gentleman here. Yes.
Hi, I'm Steve Wolfson from US EPA. Great presentations. Thanks very much. And thanks, Scott and CSIS for bringing them here to discuss these issues. My question is whether you can tie, I think all the issues you've been talking about are very incredibly important. Can you tie that to regional and global issues? And specifically what I'm thinking of is things like the recyclable materials that get stopped at the border of China. Do those land in Vietnam or Laos or Cambodia or somewhere else instead, where there might be less ability to manage the waste appropriately than in China? And then are Chinese exports and investments and exports of old technologies affecting other countries in the region and perhaps even beyond? I just recently read a report that indicated that the average PM 2.5 in Hanoi was only 3 percentage points better last year than in Beijing. So is that a trend that we should be concerned about for the region and the world? Thanks.
Sure. Thank you very much. Chris is really the creator of the series and the reason that we're doing this. And so we're appreciating this. Let me frame the question, just to add a little bit to the side of it. So I would interpret your question as, what are the externalities that China's efforts might be creating elsewhere? But are there potential positives? Are there things that they may be encouraging the rest of the region to do in a constructive way? I hope it's okay if I just sort of add the balance to ask about both sides of it, possibly, even though the answer may be that it's the externalities that's the most visible. I don't know.
I mean, China's jolted the global recycling world. It won't air until April, but I was on a radio interview the other day for BBC Radio, and there were a couple plastic industry folks, and they're just like, we can't believe it, right? I mean, they have to totally rethink, well, where are we going to put this waste? And you're right, Steve, just like it's moving into Southeast Asia. It's really ramped it up, and so it's just, but from the Chinese side, I mean, they're also looking inward at their own waste problem. I mean, I think, outside they were using the line, the foreigners are they're putting toxic things in with these recyclable imports, and we don't want it. It's probably not really the truth, but they really want to solve some of their own problems, and they want to move up the feeding chain. So in their mind, they're just seeing like the domino effect of those dirty industries. But ultimately, I mean, they're according a lot of the experts, the plastic experts in the world, are saying that we need to do major rethinking in our own country. I mean, I'm thinking about, think today, how many times have you touched plastic today and used it, right? And then tossed it in the recycling bin. So but so in some ways, China maybe has, jolted the world into new thinking, or we're just going to ship our waste to Southeast Asia. There's that. Do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, on the positive externality, I mean, there are some clear positive externalities, like lowering the cost of solar, say, for example, right? Like the drive has led to some positive externalities. But I think this issue of transfer of the demand, let's say steel and cement, these type of production moves elsewhere, there's a question of direct Chinese investment or financing, right? And these things are all open questions. I think people are trying to track, with this Belt and Road Initiative, to what extent is this export of pollution? And I think there are a lot of open questions about it.
I mean, 80% of their energy investments on the Belt and Road Initiatives are fossil fuels. I mean, the Boston College has a database on this. I mean, But you have to keep in mind too that it's not like Beijing is saying, coal-fired power plant move those out to Pakistan. But it's more that the provinces themselves, the companies are like we have the engineers, we have the technology. Pakistan wants energy. I mean, they are bringing along some clean energy, but there's a lot of conversations happening with the World Resources Institutes, and even Chinese NGOs are talking. They're going to the countries where China's investing and getting them to say, like, you should ask for cleaner technology, right? So it's utterly fascinating, and I don't think I'm going to work over the next year to try to get more people to come in and tell these stories, because I mean, you're right, Alex, we don't actually know what all the impact is. But there are some things like let's go on a totally different topic, desalination. China, they want more desal to make clean, fresh water out of ocean water, but it's highly energy intensive. But they're throwing money into this to make it more efficient. Maybe that's good for the world. So I mean, the Chinese, but they do these things, like you said, there's always a good business angle for them.
Yeah, the Bohai Gulf and Beijing, where the water table's like. Let's go here in the front.
Thank you, Scott. I'd like
Can
to
you just identify
follow.
yourself for everyone?
I'm Frank Zhao with China Daily newspaper here in DC. Well, I'd like to follow the international cooperation on pollution control, as mentioned by Scott just now. And this question for Jennifer and Alex. Do you see rising or shrinking cooperation between China and the United States in pollution control in the first year of Trump's presidency? And what do you think are the priorities and the potentials for this cooperation in the years ahead? Thank you.
You can ask Steve about EPA production cooperation.
So to clarify your question, you're referring to government cooperation? Maybe it wasn't you. Okay, well, I think that, keep in mind, it's not all about, sorry to my EPA friends, it's not all just gov to gov, bilateral government cooperation that's really been the good news story for US-China environmental cooperation. Besides the NGOs, we got think tanks, we have companies, we have universities, and cities and US states. And over the years that I know Alex and all of us have been watching it, we had the Al Gore kind of a lot of cooperation with the government, and then it disappeared under Bush, and then it went way high under Obama, and it's not a priority more. I mean, I haven't seen a lot of action, but it's not that it's going to go away. I think that there's still, as Alex said, there's a lot of organizations, the NGOs, the universities, and the state of California, the country of California, right? They have lots of MOUs and cooperative projects with Chinese cities, Chinese provinces. Even NRDC was the matchmaker for Jiangsu in California on demand-side management. I mean, again, there's still things going on, but and the foundation world is in some ways rising up to help support some of this work. But yeah, personally, I'd like to think that this cooperation is not going to, maybe we're getting a little bit of a low on the government side. That said, I think on illegal wildlife trade, we might see some action. Yeah, it's still a year into this new administration. We still see what might emerge. But yeah, it's a little quieter now, admittedly.
Yeah, I think with California, there's been a lot of cooperation. And I think we should also keep in mind the nature of the cooperation has changed, right? Mm-hmm. So, we've all been engaged in this kind of cooperation business for a long time, and the sophistication from the Chinese side has really increased. So because now a lot of people are tasked with getting specific things done, they're having direct exchanges with the technical people in Cal EPA, for example. These days, there's sort of the traditional study tours. You come and visit, you see what's going on. Plus, there's Beijing EPB sent a few people to California, and they were there for months. And Cal EPA arranged meetings for them every day for several months all throughout the state. And so very intense cooperations in some cases. And so I think that's good, and it's needed, and that's the place where China is these days.
Second row here, and then we'll come back here next.
Yes, hello, I'm Humberto Limas. I'm a student at the University of Colorado Boulder. And it's very interesting to tell that what you said, Doctor, and the fact that there are many NGOs in China working to try to solve this environmental crisis, and are actually working with the Chinese government. But the Chinese government is a very authoritarian one, and their human rights record is very spotty, to be very diplomatic. And my question is, To what extent is this cooperation real, and how long is China going to tolerate this civilian activism towards the environment before they try to crack it down?
You're referring to the international cooperation?
Local cooperation in the NGOs.
Local, and well, I mean, a lot of times there's a combo. I mean, I think that, I find, Alex, you agree with me, the Chinese government is pragmatic, right? They're looking to solve the problems. And sometimes when it works, you know, he alluded to already that sometimes the NGOs, you know, they do, and journalists do a little bit of self-censorship. But ultimately, you know, I mean, the government seems to be, you know, I mean, and also what do we mean by government? I mean, look at, I gave you the example of Hunan. The Hunan EPB absolutely loves green Hunan because it's making their life easier because we're getting data and we're able to enforce the way we need to. And, you know, again, there's always, and I know Jing can kind of probably leap up and give us plenty of examples where, you know, when you step over the line. But see, the NGOs are also very pragmatic and smart, and they know, like, maybe when to stomp on the toe and back up a little bit. So, I mean, you know, it's like, the Chinese NGOs know the system in which they operate, and they have found ways to build good partnerships. And the same thing true for the international NGOs. As I said before, they're kind of a glue. And when you look at, you know, more than just a glue, I mean, think of like the Energy Foundation that's based in China. They support Chinese researchers and other organizations, and they've helped shape better laws and regulations and building capacity. So, you know, I think that, and it really, you know, maybe some agencies are not as welcoming to the foreign or Chinese, you know, the grassroots NGOs, but a lot of them are. I mean, the people who are doing the environmental work, you know, kind of like, bring it on.
Yeah, so, you know, the things that you're alluding, you know, so for example, human rights violations against rights lawyers, you know, that's going on in China, but there's also the environmental work, right? It's a big country with a lot of things going on. So those two things, in some sense, on one hand, they're sort of parallel issues, right? On the other hand, the cooperation on the environment side happens within a particular political environment that has a particular attitude towards social risk. You know, you could view it as a state regulating, you know, foreign intrusion, you know, these types of, if you want to frame it that way, right? You could frame it that way, and you could see how they're regulating these things that, you know, in a liberal democratic system, most of these things are not things that we, or, you know, there's a different approach to that, right? So, you know, I've written a bit about how NGOs try to navigate that system, and it is a real challenge to navigate that system, but it's navigable, I guess.
You should read his stuff.
Yeah.
Definitely. I come right here to the front.
Jing.
Zhang Jingjing, environment litigator, and Annex Wang from colleague. And actually, my two comments. The first one is relevant to your question. And as a lawyer, I started my career since 1999, and as an environment lawyer, and I have experienced participant in the environment movement since then. And I saw the big change around 2012, and we used to have a very active and vibrant civil society space, and which we worked for years. And Annex Wang and other international NGOs, local NGOs, and I saw the change after new leadership took power. And even though the NGO, environment NGO, have found their way and to go around the difficulty, but the issues, these NGO are challenging the government. And they choose to be advisor to the government, or they cooperate with the government. And the few of them can dare to challenge a government, means bring litigation to sue against factories or government. And that's my point. Is China became a closing space for civil society organizations. That is my first comments, and based on my experience and my own experience. And the second is relevant to my current research, and why Chinese government initiated this new geopolitical strategy, One Belt, One Road initiative, and you see more and more Chinese companies, and they are going out, and they brought the economic power to the rest of the world, and they also export their own norm, their way to business from China to the rest of the world. And I have following those Chinese companies and saw the same pattern, what they have done back home in China and they have done in developing world. And pollution and then the forced relocation and other human rights violations. So that is my comments. Where we are all facing the even bigger problem than controlling pollution inside China.
Sure.
But it's really the kind of work that you're doing, and there are Friends of the Earth and others. I mean, this is really vital information because, again, you can't really, the record on Belt and Road is the jury's out.
Yeah, we're still getting, I think we've got time for one more question. This gentleman right here.
Hi, I'm Phil Sharp, formerly with Resources for the Future, but I've been on for many years on the board of directors of the Energy Foundation. And just to reinforce, because its purposes were always to work cooperatively with the government to push these things, it managed to sustain itself through all the political changes, especially in recent years. It operates radically different in the United States. In the United States, it aggressively tries to pressure the politicians and the agencies of government to act, but there it never does that. It works in a different manner. This led to a lot of frustration with some of the more aggressive international NGOs who were hoping to have a greater civil society and do a lot of other issues. And for a while, they were rather distressed that the Energy Foundation did not engage in the same way. But I think it's now turning out that the Energy Foundation has more of a prized position and in the new national security law. And I may be wrong about that, but it got its approvals immediately, practically, and everything because of that style of operation. But it only works because it supports, as you mentioned, the government goals kind of thing. And it's a frustration within the foundation, frankly.
But it's also, it did, working like, supporting groups like NRDC.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, to think that the Energy Foundation, by the grantees they supported, helped put things on the agenda. The Chinese government was not talking coal consumption cap. And I remember when NRDC was first talking to me about that, a number of years ago, I said, "You guys are crazy, right?" But
no,
they
the foundation
did it.
supported that.
But you guys, but the
as
fact
long
is,
as it was a discussion.
Yeah, but I think and other funders as well. But the fact is that just because groups like Energy Foundation, that they're based in China, that they're not being huge advocates against things the government is doing, but the influence that they've had by simply really steering the agenda. Yeah. Fingerprints all over all those clean energy laws.
And here they are for the war on coal. So.
Yeah, well, there's the war on coal.
I think an interesting background point, I think someone just made a mention of sort of the legitimacy of the way China is doing this. I think a broader point, I've been interested in this sort of debate about what's a legitimate way to run a government, right? So there's this kind of competition between the American way and this China more state-run way. And I think it'll be interesting to see in the years going forward how the environmental issue plays out and how that affects the global view of China's legitimacy. Because I think they've gotten a lot of positive press on the climate stuff. To the extent that they're sort of getting success on the air pollution side, I think some people, you hear this, not infrequently from foreigners, our democracy is so inactive, or stuck, and I wish I could get things done like that, right? And so of course, so I think there's an interesting debate there that the environment is certainly helping the Chinese state in sort of bolstering its legitimacy in a way that not everyone in DC would be necessarily happy about.
Well, I think if that might be a good place to kind of wrap this up and put a bow on it, because it brings us back to a very large point that we try to address through our China Reality Check series, which is to talk about issues that don't get talked enough about Washington, at least at CSIS. I mean, you do provide a lot of leadership in Washington and the country, and as Alex does as well. It's obviously a complex story, right? We've got this engagement with the China model, looking at through the lens of the environment. We've seen some progress in terms of the prioritization, in terms of some of the efforts and new initiatives and level of detail. We obviously still have some challenges. We've got data challenges and others to try and really measure what performance is going to be. And then how does domestic society in China and the international community engage in a way that helps move the needle to make it as more than cosmetic as possible, right? So so that they live up to their word as much as well. But it also requires us to do some soul searching too, because we have to look in Washington. We can think about some of the challenges that we have in terms of our, government and where we're going as well in this. A great kickoff to our series, looking at these three great battles. China is obviously engaged in this battle from many different sides. We're going to continue to be engaged in looking at these battles, so stay with us for looking at financial stability issues and then rural revitalization. But finally, please join me in thanking our two terrific panelists.
Good moderator, man. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much.
Great. That's great.
Terrific.
Don't shake it too hard.